everybody. You know, this whole conference alignment deal, when it comes to college sports and mostly college football, it's one that's been not just, I guess you could say, mired in controversy because of the teams going to newer conferences. But it's also something that, you know, when you look at it from a positive standpoint, is good for the schools, the region, and most importantly, the cable networks and television networks that more so broadcast the games of certain conferences. You know, when Nebraska and Colorado made their moves to the Big Ten and the Pac-12, everybody thought it was the most ridiculous thing you can think of. More importantly, because Colorado is not really near the Pacific coast. It's more inland of a Big 12 school. Utah, people would look at that and say, you know what, that's more suited for Pac-12, but they would also look at it and say it would be more suited just for the independents or to stay where it is. But it's all because of money. It's because of the money, and it's also because of the revenue. Well, that is money, I should say. But again, it's all back to the fact that it expands the viewership and the fan base. You see, there are people that when the Utah Utes went from the Mountain West to the Pac-12 were interested in Utah. When Utah made that great run they did a couple of years ago in the BCS, all the way into the BCS, not the championship game, but into one of the BCS games that I think won it, a lot of people were invested in them. They were invested because it's like, wow, here's this team that seemingly doesn't get that much broadcast, doesn't get that much airtime or that much exposure unless it's on their local networks. Here they are, all of a sudden, boom, coming out of nowhere and winning a BCS game. You know, the same could be said for Hawaii. I think they either won or lost their Sugar Bowl game, I can't remember. But they went to a BCS game, and they were part of the WAC. You see, it's all part of the fact that, well, one of the major reasons for this is it's all due to the fact that these schools prove that they can compete at that high level. And conferences, when they look to expand, look towards those schools and say, you know what? That school can compete with our conference. We should look into that. And that's what they do. They bring that school in. They bring that school in and they compete with the conference. Now, some might say, like, for example, Colorado, their move to the Pac-12 was the worst decision they've made because 2 years in a row they've been nothing but pathetic. I mean, they lost to Sacramento State earlier this year. So you would think, why would the Pac-12 want someone like Colorado when Colorado can't even compete on that level? Maybe they have faith in them. I don't know. But again, the conference alignments more so are about exposure, about making money, about gaining more revenue and more viewership and more exposure for the region you're in, or the region your school's in. You know, for example, the most recent conference alignments that is really going to occur next year has to do with the Big East. Everybody thought the Big East was, you know, done and buried, basically. Like, the Big East was on the verge of being placed into a coffin, nailed shut, and buried 6 feet under. But now look, just like the phoenix, it rises from the ashes. And how does it rise from the ashes? In what many feel is the most controversial way, if not one of the most talked about ways. Now, before I get to the Big East, let me use another example. Big 12. The Big 12 just needs one more team to get back to conference championship status. But when the Big 12 added TCU, hey, that was fine. They lost Texas A&M and Missouri to the SEC, TCU is a perfect fit. But then they added West Virginia. And people thought to themselves, West Virginia? You serious? They're on the East Coast. Well, again, it's about revenue and exposure. And it's also to see how good a team does, a school does, in a newer conference against teams that they would, schools and teams that they would only face, let's say, in the postseason. West Virginia, I will give them credit, looked strong at the beginning, but as soon as they got into that tough conference play schedule, and they started playing against their new conference rivals, only then did it start, I think, reality started to hit West Virginia when they realized, oh shit, we're fighting against this team. We're fighting against teams that have made the Big 12 what it is. It's, reality's hitting, some like West Virginia, like, wow, we're good, but no wonder people talk about these teams talk about the Big 12 and these teams that's in it. These teams are just as good as they're advertised. And that's reality that hits you when you finally get to that conference. Some teams can handle it, some teams can't. For example, Texas A&M. Yeah, I know a lot of fans are not happy with the fact that A&M is now in the SEC. But you gotta admit, the SEC is a great fit for Texas A&M. They're pretty much south anyway. Maybe not eastern, not southeast, but close to it, to the point that they can use it. And then you got Missouri, and you say to yourself, Missouri's not SEC. They're still Big 12, just like with Colorado. But again, Missouri's had the exposure it's had with the Big 12's national conglomerate, if you will. So they figured to get a bigger exposure, SEC's perfect. There you go. But just like Colorado has learned in the past 2 years, just like West Virginia's learned, or has learned, and is learning, and Missouri's learning the same thing. They're realizing a change of conference doesn't always mean an easier schedule. I mean, you got to realize this: Missouri spent a whole year without competing in a conference championship game or having to play for a shot in a conference championship game, and now all of a sudden they're in a conference to where they got to play for a conference championship. And it's like I said before in a previous video, Missouri and Colorado, to me, are the most likely teams to decide down the line to go back to where they belong, back to the Big 12, and say, you know what, we'd rather be here than be in conferences we have no idea about, or we have no business being in the first place. But then, speaking of conference alignments, you take a look at the Big East, going back to it. The Big East, like I said earlier, everybody thought it would be dead and buried, nailed in the coffins, buried 6 feet under. But like the phoenix has risen from the ashes. And how did they do that? They did it by the most controversial means necessary. They did it by adding several western, if not south. They did it by adding western, southern teams to the conference. And what are those teams, you may ask? Those teams are if I can find it here, Houston, SMU, Memphis, Boise State, and San Diego State. Now, oh shit, I hate when that happens. Whew. Luckily it's okay. Now, Boise State, San Diego State, Houston, Memphis, among the teams that have been added, the western teams like Houston, like San Diego State, Boise State, Houston, Memphis, I believe. I'm trying to see who else. and SMU, Boise State, San Diego State, Houston, Memphis, SMU, and currently Big East member Temple will be part of the West Division. Okay, I'm just taking my time, so I got plenty of time. Right. But they will be part of the West Division. While the other Big East teams like Louisville, Rutgers, and probably the last season with them, ironically, Cincinnati, and UCF, I'm trying to find out who else here. I'll get back to it. But Cincinnati, UCF, Rutgers, Louisville, Cincinnati, UCF, and I'm trying to think who else is in the Big East right now, or will be in the Big East, because I know there's more than just one member. But anyway, you're going to have 6 teams in a West Division. A West Division in a Big East Conference. You're going to have 6 teams in an East Division in the Big East Conference. What sense does that make? Here it is. New York Times. We'll have it. But like I said, you got Boise State, you got San Diego State, you got Temple, a Philadelphia-based school, Houston, SMU, okay, here it is. West Division. Houston, Memphis, San Diego State, SMU, Temple, and Boise State. I think they forgot to add that. So yeah. Boise State, Houston, oh no, they have it. Boise State, Houston, Memphis, San Diego State, SMU, and Temple. West Division. The East Division will be Central Florida, UCF, South Florida, Connecticut, Louisville, Cincinnati, and possibly in the last season with the conference, Rutgers. Now, what does that tell you? Now, what does that tell you about the conference alignments when it comes to the Big East? It tells you that the Big East is risen from the ashes like the phoenix, but they do it in the most controversial and talked about way. Because just like with West Virginia, just like with Missouri and Colorado, a lot of people are going to look at this and say, Boise State, San Diego State, Houston, or more so Boise State and San Diego State, but then they might talk about Houston, they might mention SMU. They would say those teams have no business being in the Big East. Now, making a West Division would make sense, but still makes no, it makes no sense. Because geographically, you have so many ways, so many miles to travel. Someone, they even use for an example, if Boise State went down to play UCF in a conference game, they'd have to travel over 2,000 something miles, 5,000 something miles just to go play them. And be the other way around. And San Diego State would even have a further trip. Even have further to go. And that's why a lot of people find it controversial that this is happening. Or kind of look at it as being very controversial in happening. But again, it's all about money and national exposure, as well as teams finally having a chance to go to a BCS. And I will explain that in the second part.